this video, I'd like to talk about how to analyze public policy or how to study social policy, particularly for students who are thinking about a research topic, a course essay, or a thesis topic, be it at the master's or doctoral level. They're interested in policy and they often ask, how do I go about doing research for public policy? Or what does it mean to analyze or to study in a rigorous, scholastic way public policy, which often seems so amorphous or fluid, a little foggy or mysterious. So how does one in a scholarly way, a more rigorous way, analyze public policy? And so this video I'll talk a bit about some of the techniques and steps or choices that are available in how to approach studying public policy. First of all, one easy decision to make first of all is whether you're interested in actually studying the substance of an existing policy or the substance of a proposed new policy. And sometimes the new ones are the more exciting ones. They're perhaps in the news, they've been more recently debated or discussed in political arenas or mobilized by social movements or interest groups. The challenge there though is often that it's still a policy in process. It's still a very fluid, perhaps it hasn't even been decided upon by the legislature or by a government to make a policy in that area. It's more you're interested in a policy issue or a demand for a new policy response. But nonetheless, that can be a very attractive policy. The challenge then is to look at data or research sources that refer or rely on interviews with participants, perhaps media accounts and coverage, social media as well as traditional news media or journalistic accounts. And perhaps if you're also involved in the issue yourself, participant observation. If you're engaged directly in a cause or in a movement, or you work with a community group or an interest group, keeping a diary or a journal of your own observations and those you work in and around with can be another valuable source. But if you're interested in studying perhaps the history of a policy area, then obviously there'll be more documentation, more experience, and perhaps an academic literature associated with the policy in question. For example, if you're interested in homelessness, in the contemporary context, you can easily go back and find all sorts of debates and developments and policy responses by governments over the last 90, 100 years, whether it be the Depression in the 1930s or homelessness issues in the 1960s or again in the 1980s or 1990s or today in current times. So historical policy analysis at first may seem drier or not as exciting, but the benefit there is that there's an availability usually of other data sources, other kinds of literature. There may not be some people around that you could talk to from some of those earlier time periods, but that might be substituted, or the advantage might be that there's other sources that you can address. If you're not interested in substance so much as process, and this is where you can look at not so much what the policy is or how the decisions resulted in a specific law or regulation or a particular benefit or decision that results in a new right or a new responsibility to a particular group, but you're interested in the processes of how the policy was made. What were the ways and means that were followed? What were the procedures? What kinds of structural arrangements or consultation processes or stakeholder involvements were there with respect to the policy? So these are very interesting kinds of analyses as well, sometimes called a process evaluation or a process analysis, as compared to the more policy studies, which usually refers to examining the substance, the actual content of a particular policy or program area. As again, to take the housing example, particular housing program for co-op, for example, or nonprofit housing, and to look at how the program is actually designed, how it works, how it's implemented. Process evaluation is interested in those things, but in a more secondary way. The primary focus is clearly on the ways and means, the procedures, and who was involved and who wasn't, and how that might have some bearing on the eventual outcome and the eventual content that resulted in the policy. How much legitimacy the policy had, again, speaks to the processes involved and who actually had an opportunity to have their voices heard or their ideas inputted into the process. I've already alluded to another couple of choices on how to study public policy, and that's time frame, whether one wants to look at a more contemporary issue and or an historical perspective. And looking at history can provide us with some lessons of what previous decision making resulted in, some of the patterns that resulted from historical programs that may still exist today, and help understand perhaps why governments do what they do and why they don't do other certain things, why there may be a resistance to innovation maybe due to the fact that there is a well-established set of interests and investments in a particular program area. There may be certain professional or occupational groups that their own livelihood and their own social status is tied very much to an existing set of programs and policy arrangements. So history can shed some very interesting political light on current policy issues. A couple of other approaches would be a case study, often an in-depth look at a specific policy or program, taking a particular focus on it, a particular time period, time A to time B, a specific place or site or jurisdiction, and looking at a particular set of events around that decision. So case studies, sometimes people say they can't generalize from them. That may be true in one sense, but they provide tremendous rich depth in understanding the particularities of a given area. What you can generalize from a case study is analytical ideas, or to try out some concepts or theories or theoretical propositions from the literature. And so your case study can be a laboratory or a test case for examining and critiquing how useful particular concepts are from a literature, and also how robust or how predictive or how authentic sounding or reliable certain theoretical ideas are. So one should never apologize for doing a case study when examining policy. And of course there's also comparative approaches. This could be multiple case studies or different jurisdictions looking at the same issue. In Canada, where we have 10 provinces and 3 territorial governments, there's always the opportunity to look at how all of those jurisdictions, or a subsample of say 2 or 3 different provinces from different regions of the country, have approached a certain issue, whether it's on poverty or hunger or homelessness or helping people with student loans or what have you, and just look at how different jurisdictions have approached it, how they frame the issues, how they've designed their programs, how they've been implemented, and what impacts or effects they've had. So there's lots of choices on how to actually analyze public policy. It's really up to you and the time period you have to do this. There may be deadlines, what your own interests are. But there's also the opportunity for participant observation increasingly, especially for those of you who might be in a graduate program at the master's or doctoral level, to pick an area where you've got some connection already with community service or volunteer work you've done, or because of family interests or perspectives or your own particular interests politically or socially, to look at a policy area that draws you in as not just the observer or researcher, but as someone who's had some connections with people in that community. Interacting with people in a particular participation can be a very valuable technique, as well as allowing some observations where you can take notes, keep a journal, and record events around you, as well as then reflecting on your own experiences in that policy case study, which then leads us to interpretations of the data that you've collected on the policy, and really how you interpret the data and what you want to do with it for doing a policy analysis gets to other questions about what the ultimate purpose of the research is. Is it for a thesis with particular hypotheses or research questions that you've been addressing? Has it been a more exploratory research just to find out what's going on in this area and how things work, or what seems to be the way things are unfolding or developing in a particular area? So a lot of policy analysis does lean quite heavily on good, rich description and some observation, perhaps some critique, and also then drawing some interpretations and conclusions. It also allows you, depending on what audience you're writing the research for. I find sometimes doing research for community groups, nonprofits, one important element is to write in plain language. Be careful about the theoretical or academic jargon one might employ that would be quite proper in a thesis or an article or a book chapter or what have you in a more of a university or academic setting. But to have the challenge and opportunity to think about how to express it in a very accessible language to community groups and how they can then engage with it. So sometimes writing up the final chapter to a thesis, if you think about different audiences who may be reading your policy analysis, it can be very helpful in clarifying ideas and appreciating that you're thinking about implications not only for research but also for practitioners or for the public, as well as for trying to satisfy a thesis committee or a few academics that you're doing the work with. So those are some ideas on how to analyze public policy, some of the steps, some of the choices and questions that are there for anyone who's thinking about I'd like to do some policy research. I'd like to study social policy and how to do it. So thank you very much.